Welcome to the Leadership Book Club at Thoughtexchange. My name is Anya McLeod. Thank you so much for taking some time this morning or this afternoon if you're joining us from Eastern Time to talk about crucial conversations. So Crucial Conversations, subtitled Tools for Talking When Stakes Are High. Very timely. When we picked this topic back in January, we didn't know maybe how timely it was, but I'm really looking forward to discussing this today. So just to set your expectations as viewers and participants in this, I'll be spending the first 25 minutes or so talking about the book. So basically my goal is to give you a Cole's Notes versions of this with some key concepts, some takeaways. If you've read the book, can act as a good refresher, and maybe it can stimulate you to think about how you might have this conversation within your own organization or your own life. So before we dive into the book, I just ask you to join the conversation. So here's a couple of hashtags. One is Vital Smarts, which is an organization created by the four co-authors of this book. And the other one is our hashtag TEVE, which stands for Thought Exchange Virtual Events. So please, LinkedIn, Twitter, what have you, it's always good. So about the book, usually this is the part where I have a picture of like the author and I give you a blurb about the author. In this case, however, there's four authors, so I'm not going to get into who they are and what they do individually. They've co-authored 4 books, and they've started this organization, a consultancy around organizational development called Vital Smarts. So there's a couple things about this book that are very different. One is, rather than it being a compelling story told from the perspective of a Kim Scott or Brene Brown, it's written by 4 people. So it's got the voice that's much more manual than it is story. So think about this book as a manual. It's shorter, it's like about 200 pages or so. So what I've done is I've recommended how to read this book. I read this book from start to finish, but when I got to the end, I was like, I think I would give busy people a guide to how to read this book. So for example, putting it all together is the chapter 11. That gives a really great summary of the book. So if you've got 15 minutes, read those 12 pages. And then I went back to chapter 1, explaining what is a crucial conversation. And then I would go to the afterword to find out a little bit more about the authors, because that's the place where they put in how writing this book and living this book has affected them. And then chapter 10 is where they deal with the objections, which is, I can't have crucial conversations because, or yeah, but that's great. So that's actually a very valuable chapter. And then if you have the time, like that, those 4 parts of it will take you less than an hour. If you have time, go to chapter 2 onwards. Just a note about the authors. One thing that's pretty glaring, as I have these 4 pictures up there, is they're a pretty homogenous group. So I'm looking at them, you know, they look like what a leader might have looked like 30 years ago if you did a Google search, or 10 years ago, sadly. I don't want to fault the authors for that, but thinking through there's universal applicability to this, but thinking about those conversations and the learnings of this book and applying them to things like diversity, things like gender, I think it'd be really key. And the authors do a great job in their online videos of trying to embrace more diverse models. They can't help who they are, but I just wanted to acknowledge the fact that they are these gentlemen of a certain age and a certain ethnicity. So what are crucial conversations? Well, there's 3 aspects to crucial conversations. In order for it to be crucial, there have to be 3 variables. One is opposing opinions. If you're in violent agreement about something, that can be heated, but it's not really the case where there's opposing opinions. There may be underlying opposing opinions that aren't being unearthed. So another thing is strong emotions. We all know when we're in a crucial conversation by what our body's doing. Our face may be going red, our jaw may be clenching, we may be holding our breath, or just really starting to heat up like volcanoes that we all are. And then the stakes are high. So don't confuse the issue at hand with the stakes, because if you've ever had a conversation with your spouse about something trivial, or with a colleague about something kind of maybe a very small aspect of a project, it's not the actual thing. It's a part of a larger issue, right? It could be respect, which is a very fundamental thing. That's a pretty high stake. So the authors talk about how at the heart of every problem, in the organization and our relationships, like crucial conversations. And it's not in the crucial conversations, it's in the absence of crucial conversations, or the fact we're not holding them well. So in terms of business applications, I include a quote here. The book has every chapter starts with a quote. I'm a sucker for that stuff, but I really like this one from George Bernard Shaw, is that the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion it has taken place. And so I've given some places where this is business applications for this, but I think that the fact is that we sometimes as leaders or as contributors or whatever, we confuse communication, like, oh, I'm going to send an email on that, with meaningful two-way dialogue. So communication and dialogue are not exactly the same thing. And here are some just business applications. The thing I want to point your attention to in our current times is the last two: executive leadership and cross-functional or matrix organizations. So executive leaders, there's a tendency for executive leaders to become insulated from what people might think. And then often people want to protect them from that information. They may not want to distract them, or they're fearful of their own position. So I think now with this giant recalibration and reset of society, it's a really good time, if you are in an executive leadership position or report to an executive leader, is to practice some detachment and stand back and be like, have what we've done before served us? And does it serve us moving forward? And the other point is around cross-functional or matrix organizations. As we move all from a work from home model currently, and then, you know, it's uncertain moving forward, cross-functionality can really break down quickly in a remote model. So before I get into why an organization should care about crucial conversations, I'm going to talk about why you should care personally. So the authors give quite a lot of detail around this, but for personal health, the stress level that you have from carrying around silence or from acting in ways that you're not proud of and then justifying it, you know, like there's a latent stress that we all carry around when we don't actually express ourselves, or we express ourselves poorly. So there's a great thing where, you know, the disconnect between personal, professional is now more blurry than it's ever been. And actually, thank goodness, because personally, I really liked being able to see my customers, for example, at home with their kids running in and out of the room, and their hair may be messy. And I think this is, if anything, is an opportunity to see each other more wholly as humans, as human beings. And so what you learned here from this book, it's, you know, like I said, is kind of a manual-like book, but you can apply it to your individual relationships. So that's a marvelous thing as well. Kickstarting your career. Often we think of, you know, speaking frankly as career suicide, but having honest conversations about how you would like to progress, what problems you might see in an organization. If it's done right, it can actually move you very quickly. And you get a better understanding of other people's perspectives. And the final thing I'll say is improving your organizations. So if you're a leader in an organization, obviously you want to be able to take what you read and apply it to the health of the organization. So I have here, why should you care now? Well, because right now we are facing an economic downturn. Like in my lifetime, this is probably the most unsettled or unknown that things have been. So these are the names, these things in capitals are the names of studies that either the authors have done themselves or that they reference. So financial agility, they're saying you respond 5 times faster to financial downturns when you are able to have crucial conversations well. So that's something to consider, because I know there's a lot of just budget upheaval right now. Like people are not knowing what the future holds. And they talk about the cost of conflict avoidance. They quantify that for some of you people that are more quantifiable people. But I really like the next title of the study. The study's called Long Distance Loathing. So this is really key. This is what I said about the cross-functional or remote teams, is that when you don't have trust, like imagine you have people in an office and they don't necessarily trust each other, but they work okay. As soon as you separate those people and get them to rely on video conferencing or email or Slack or whatever, that they start to get fractured a lot more quickly. And so 3 times more, like they triple the effect that you have in a co-located situation with remote teams. So it's something to think about. I think a lot of people right now are struggling with how to lead remotely. And I think that they almost want to pull back or create processes or protocols or, these kinds of things versus leaning into conversation. But I think that you're going to start to see things unraveling and projects falling apart very quickly because of that effect. And then the final thing I'll talk about here, silent danger, is as we move people back to the workplaces, transitionally, however it may be, we're 2/3 more likely to avoid injury or death, or in this case, sickness due to unsafe conditions. So Atul Gawande writes a lot about this from a hospital setting, but this is applicable obviously for everybody as we try to keep our people safe. The last point is pandemic or no pandemic, there's this report, Corporate Untouchables. One of the benefits of having these conversations is we can influence others. So a really depressing study that they did was they surveyed 1,000 people and 93% of them said those people who are bullying, conniving, dishonest, they've stayed in their position for 4 years or longer in the organization, hence the untouchability of them. So the audacious claim of the people who wrote this book is that, first of all, they don't talk about this, but this mindset thing, when you set something, like for you bakers out there, or when you set something, you give it shape and it sits there like a jello, right? So we need to shift our mind away from this mindset. So the audacious claim they make, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar and know this intrinsically, that this is where culture eats strategy for breakfast, as Peter Drucker said, is because if you focus on things like process, structures, systems, things I love because I'm a project manager by training, so I love these things, but these are non-human change. It's employee behavior that will actually affect the change. So the real change doesn't lie in implementing a new process. It's in getting people to hold each other accountable. So this is not just you as the leader holding people accountable, it's everybody doing it together. So if you want a process to succeed, and I've created beautiful processes that have never gone anywhere because I've tried to bully people in a charming way into doing them, but I haven't understood that they need to be understood, they need to be heard, and they need to feel the impact of adopting a new process themselves. So a key concept in the book is called the fool's choice or the sucker's choice. So I chose the image on the left with silence because I want to pay homage to pandemic hair, which I think when everything opens up and we all get to go back to our hairdressers, we should have like a mass global Zoom where we can all just take down our hair and have a moment of silence perhaps. But the silence part of it is not about the hair. It's about how we withdraw from conversations because we think the choice is, if I speak, it's career suicide, I'll hurt someone's feelings. So I'm going to not rock the boat. I'm going to not derail the project. I'm going to be silent. I think the thing to ask yourself there is, are you protecting them or are you protecting yourself? Like who's actually, when you honestly unpack that, who's actually standing to gain from that silence? So the fool's choice though is I preserve the relationship by being silent, or I get results, I win, I reveal myself as a keeper of justice and truth in the organization by perpetuating violence. And obviously not with the spinning ball of death, but with things like sarcasm or put downs or calling out somebody in a way that embarrasses them. Those things can be effective on the surface, superficially, where you can justify your bad behavior by saying, well, someone had to say it. But those are violent ways of acting upon other people. So where you want to have is this idea that you can give feedback without it being confrontational, but neither is it this Pollyanna kind of reality that when I did a Google search for giving feedback, I got these images which are like, oh, these people look just so fulfilled and mindful and leaning in and all these kinds of cliches. I put the captions there, but it's like, this is just meant to illustrate the wonder of giving feedback. And golly gee, it's just a big learning for everybody here. So I think the reality is when we've been in those situations, not in our universally gray suits, but when we've been in the situations, as the authors point out, our reptile brain takes over because we are wired not to do that. Golly gee, I'm leaning in. We're wired to be like, okay, I'm under attack, right? I'm being called out, I'm being punished. And so we get that really reptilian response, which is we seize up, our breath shortens or even ceases. You're just like, just go into lockdown. And so I just took some off, some captions here where the person who may be explaining something is like, oh God, I have to explain this again. Why don't you get this? Like, it's so obvious, without thinking about the perspective on the other hand is like, okay, here you go again. You're patronizing me. You're explaining your dumb process that only you follow. So maybe we can all have a little moment of empathy for these people where we've been in, well, we tried to have a crucial conversation, but it's been superficial. And so what's really going on is never talked about because it feels ugly and something that's not going to serve the conversation. So another key concept of the book of Crucial Conversations is creating this pool of shared meaning. And, I'm not a huge person who loves kind of like language like mindfulness or pool of shared meaning. It starts to kind of go into a bit of a Disneyfication of reality, but I do like this concept of this shared meaning, a pool of shared meaning. So the image I've got here, I don't know if this is like a Scandinavian extended family or something, but the reason I like this image is because it illustrates people that are all in the same place, but they're all in different parts of the water. Some of them are fully in the water, some of them are on the side. They're expressing different intentions. Some of there are for a sense of adventure, like those kids. Some there are to look at the rocks and maybe you have more scientific curiosity. Some of there, maybe this is their bucket list. Who knows? But there is a diversity here of people that's really important to create that pool of shared meaning. So you're not excluding anybody. So I think the key thing is a pool of shared meaning is not ideas that we vet, that we say, yes, we're in agreement about them. They get to go in the pool for discussion. These are ideas we agree to add to the conversation, regardless of where they come from, regardless of what we consider their merit. So for those of you that are familiar with Thoughtexchange, this is like our share step, where we invite people into the conversation with an open-ended question, which we'll be doing in a few minutes ourselves, and then everybody gets to have a voice. And then the group decides what should surface out of that pool of shared meaning. So another key learning here is starting with heart. And I just wanted to give a shout out to the big hair gals of the 80s. But obviously I mean heart as in our heart. So love, empathy, but also courage, right? And you have to have the courage when you're in a crucial conversation or going to start a crucial, especially when you're going to start a crucial conversation, is asking yourself, what do I really want for myself? What is my intention in having this conversation? Now, obviously, if you don't start the conversation, you go right to that reptile place because it can take you by surprise and you don't know the answers. So you're like, oh. But I think that for all the reading I've done for this book club and others, I think the key thing is taking that moment of reflection is the key piece, like asking yourself, what do I really want for myself? And it's not that either or, it's not that silence or violence. It's like, I do want to improve my relationship with this coworker. I do want this project to succeed. And I don't want this person to take it the wrong way. I don't want to derail the project. And so just being really clear, and instead of seeing it as an either or, think about it like an and. So just embrace that complexity that you can hold those two opposing wants, and it's okay. This is how you're going to work through those and hopefully achieve that outcome. And then also ask yourself, what do I really want for others? Like if I'm doing a performance review for someone who's not performing, I don't want to punish them, probably. Like I really want them to improve. I really want them to be more autonomous, to enjoy their work more, to be more productive. So just being really honest about what you want for them, not from them, what you want for them. And what do I really want for the relationship? If you have direct reports, obviously you want your direct reports to have that balance between keeping you informed and engaged and consulted, but also just being able to make the decisions they need to make to move a project forward or to move operations forward. And if you're the opposite, if you're an individual contributor, you want guidance, but you don't necessarily want to be commanded to do things. So thinking about what you want for the relationship. Creating safety. So how we create safety is we make it safe by contrasting what you don't want and what you do want. So just being upfront about that when you're thinking about that, start with heart. And then there's a couple of acronyms here from the authors. I honestly can't remember acronyms to save my life. Like I think Roy B. Jiv from grade 4 with the spectrum of light is the only thing I've ever remembered. But I think when you use these can be quite effective. So thinking about AMP, which they say ask, mirror, paraphrase, prime. The one thing I want to caution is that mirror here doesn't mean mimicry. So I think there's sometimes in business jargon, there's this notion of mirroring someone's body language to drive the conversation forward. The authors don't actually mean that. They mean to narrate dispassionately. So let's just imagine I ask you a question, and then maybe I'll just say, I'm going to ask my colleague, okay, hey, how's it going? And they're like, fine. I'm like, oh, what's going on? Nothing. Maybe to teenagers, this is familiar as well. So I'm not going to adopt their body language. I'm not going to be like, oh, but what I'm going to say is, oh, you know, your shoulders kind of slumped and your tone went down. You don't really sound fine. What's going on, right? So you dig a little bit, but you have to do that dispassionate mirroring of their body language, of what you see. You don't say, well, you seem grumpy. You know, that's not dispassionately mirroring what someone's doing. You're meant to reflect back. Your mirror doesn't tell you look grumpy. Your mirror tells you your hair's out of place, right? So asking, mirroring, and then paraphrasing what they say. And they might just say, well, I'm really frustrated with this project. And then you're like, oh, so you're frustrated about the project, about the speed. You kind of dig. And then if you kind of come to an end where they're just like, oh, nothing's going to change, then you can think about like priming a pump. So this is where you can kind of challenge them and be a bit provocative, not in an aggressive or violent sense, but just say, oh, it sounds like you're really fed up. And sometimes you just leave that space there for them to fill. Or you could be like, I wonder what you think we could do to remedy the situation. Or what are your thoughts about what's getting in the way of this, right? So just priming them to keep that conversation going, not retreating into silence. Oh, they said things are fine. Yeah, okay. I know you got to go, you got a next meeting, but are you turning away from that opportunity to actually have that crucial conversation because you're basically copping out? And I mean, I'm as guilty of it as the next person. Sometimes that's the convenient thing to do. And sometimes it's even the right thing to do because there might be things of other higher priority. But yeah, just food for thought. And another acronym they have is ABC. Agree to, once again, that violent agreement part is don't get stuck in this conversation about how much you agree with certain things or why you agree. Agree to agree and then move on, because it's not the agreement of things that's going to hold you back. It's the where you disagree. So then build on the story, perpetually build it, and then compare. And the reason I write the definition of comparing is because it's really important to compare perspectives, because instead of saying you look grumpy or you're wrong, say you see things differently and describe how. So if you're starting to get to that, oh, my reptile is coming out, it's a really good idea just to be like, you see the project failing because we have a lack of resources. Let me tell you how I see things. I see things failing because there's a real lack of communication between the teams that are been put to this project. And then I need to describe how, right? So I can give instances, once again, using that mirroring technique to talk about things that have been done, like actually concrete things done, instead of saying, well, it seems like you and Bob don't really get along, right? Before I move on to actual examples of these, I'm just going to talk about key learning, the final key learning here, and this language, check yourself, is my language. They talk about mastering your own stories. And so I think that just if there's one thing I really took from this book, it's like how our reptile brain wants us to go from feel to act in the blink of an eye. And when we do that, it doesn't always work out. So I think that recognizing, and Brene Brown speaks to this as well in Dare to Lead, but it's like you feel something and then you go to act. Before you go to act, put a step in, take a deep breath. We tell our kids, take a deep breath to calm down. I started doing this myself. So recognize in that instant, you are telling yourself a story about what just happened. And how you're going to act is because of that story. Really great example of this we can all relate to is you're driving somewhere and someone cuts you off in traffic, or they do that thing where the lanes are merging and they pull right up and they sneak into the, you're like, dude, you should just wait. But we tell ourselves a story. That person's an idiot, right? That person is thoughtless. I'm a victim here. I'm in just as much as a rush as they are. And I hate people and I hate the city and I'm going to move out to the countryside. So we tell ourselves a story in the blink of an eye. And then we either feel like that's the villain, I'm the victim, or I'm helpless. I'm like, oh, I don't control traffic. But what we need to tell ourselves is, hey, you're telling yourself a story right now. And this is wonderful for road rage, is if you're driving and someone cuts you off, you'd be like, I'm about to tell myself a story about how this person is a jerk. What I should tell myself is this person really needs to get to the airport because his grandma, who doesn't speak any English, just arrived and she's lost and she's freaking out. Oh, I hope that guy makes it, right? So we can just really flip our perspective. And it's not about being a Pollyanna. It's not about being, false to yourself. It's just recognizing that the story you're about to tell yourself feeds your reptile, not your brain, not the bigger brain. So learn to look. And I think this is the toughest thing to do, is you need to learn to look inward and recognize your mutual purpose in having this conversation. You are trying to achieve something together. You can be right. This is something my lovely husband has taught me. It's like you can be right or you can have the conversation. And those things sometimes don't need to be the same thing, right? You need to achieve the stated outcome. So here are some real world examples. We're just about to get into an exchange, so get ready to participate. But I wanted to give you some real world examples, both from Thoughtexchange within our own company and some of our customer exchanges that they've ran. So there's a vulnerability curve we talk about that, crucial conversations are obviously pretty high on that vulnerability curve. So these examples are around Me Too, diversity, hits and misses of marketing. So I'm trying to give you a cross section from different departments, and we're happy to share this slide deck as well after this. But execution on strategic plans, cutting costs. Like a lot of people are going, how are we going to cut costs? And how do we do, this is scary, right? But asking people that can be amazing. And then the final question here is the question from my own experience at Thoughtexchange is we do our 360s through Thoughtexchange. So everybody gets to contribute to their shared pool of meaning about a person, the positive, the negative, what they need to improve, and everybody gets to see it. And that's pretty crucially important if you want to grow and flourish within an organization, is to understand how not only your immediate people perceive you, but how you're perceived in the organization. So I'm just going to take the real world example from the conversation around Me Too. And this is one that our CPO, Des Wood, who's an amazing person. If you can catch her Suddenly Remote series, she's got a webinar series, it's fantastic. But she asked this question, and what are some of the things that leaders can do to move the Me Too conversation forward in a way that includes all voices? So you can imagine if we flash back or flash forward to a mythical time where we can have a town hall in person, if the CEO or if the chief people officer stood up and asked this question, the guts it would take someone to stand up and say, well, don't assume that people who are silent on the issues are okay with the status quo. This was the #1 rated thoughts by this group. It would be very, very unusual if someone actually did that. It would be a pretty radically candid organization for some. But because they use Thoughtexchange, they were able to have that crucial conversation with that safety. And then the leader is able to comment on those thoughts as well. So it keeps the conversation going. Just a couple more thoughts from that exchange. These were the top 3 thoughts. So they talk about how the board members and shareholders should also have training around having these conversations. Once again, would you stand up at a town hall if you're an individual contributor, if the board was sitting there and say that kind of thing? But most people agreed with that. They said, if we're going to do it, we're going to do it together, right? And then the final thought was around making space for those people who are woke and awakening, which I love this thought because it's really inclusive. It's really looking at this issue, not from a victim mentality or a villain mentality, but saying we're all learning and we all need to give each other grace. So with that, I'm going to now share the exchange. Here we go. So what you can do, and Amelia is going to pop this into the chat as well. One thing you can do is you can just hold up your camera on your Google iPhone and point it at that QR code to go right into the exchange. So you don't have to take a picture of it. You just hit the camera, point it there. Your magic iPhone will grab that and then ask you to go to the browser to participate. You can also go to tejoin.com and put in this 9-digit code, or you can just click the link that Amelia has graciously put into the chat and participate that way. And so the question we're asking are, what are some of the most effective or least effective, so have fun with this, ways that leaders can actively encourage a culture of crucial conversations? So please don't be afraid to put in your thought. I'm not going to call anybody out when the thoughts come up, but what I'd love is after everyone's participated, if people want to come on mic or even on camera and talk about things, or just use the chat, and please do. And with that, I'm going to zip it. I'm going to now move. I'm going to give it a few more seconds of this just to make sure everybody can get into the exchange. And then we're going to actually start to see participation. Okay, end time. For those of you new to this view, this is called the present mode. So this is something was designed for live conversations, but obviously we're using it virtually. It's just a simplified view of things to really keep people engaged in the conversation. I have to tell you, I've been with Thoughtexchange almost 7 years, and I still get this little feeling in the pit of my stomach when I start an exchange, like, oh God, no one's going to join. So if you're a Thoughtexchange user, maybe a seasoned user or new to it or thinking about it, it's okay to have those feelings, because I have that feeling every time. So we've got 12 participants, 16 thoughts, and 137 ratings. Pretty good. Like everybody rated around 8 or 9 thoughts. So that's great. Just for those of you who are new to Thoughtexchange, what you're seeing there in that visualization are people coming into the conversation, and those navy blues are the thought bubbles, but those orange lines are where people are starring the thoughts of others. And so the thickness of those lines actually indicates the level of agreement. Whether it's a thick line, it's usually 4 or 5 stars, and then the skinny lines are someone giving a 1 or 2 star rating. And I really encourage you, if you do use Thoughtexchange, to use that full range of stars. Don't fall in the safe zone of 3 to 5 stars. Use the ones. It doesn't mean you hate the thought. It means that you don't agree with it as strongly as you agree with other thoughts. But anyway, I'm going to move into Discover here, and we can start to look at some of your wonderful thoughts. So this is where I do encourage you to raise your hand if you want to come off camera. If you're feeling, after 5 weeks of working from home and using Zoom or Teams or whatever, you're feeling that you want to engage like that, please use the chat. Come off mic and just raise your hand and Amelia will unmute you. So let's just dive into these. And please, if you want to say something, you don't have to own the thought. It doesn't have to be your thought for you to speak to it. So if you put the thought and you're kind of, you're a little shy, don't worry about it. Anybody can speak to these thoughts. We've all taken turns rating them. So let's look at the first thought. Lead by example. Admitting when they are wrong shows vulnerability and help others feel empowered to speak up also. Yes, and isn't that easy to do? Matt, come on down.
Hey, Anya.
Hello, Matt.
Yeah, I wanted to share that I actually experienced this in a strategic planning event at one point, where the CEO and the CFO actually had a debate, like a live debate, which really spoke to the aspect of, that you can disagree with, with the C-suite at that time. Like, it really shifted my participation at that time, because I was observing it happening like right in front of my eyes type thing, right? So
when you say debate, was it more like an argument or more of dialogue?
it was, yeah, it was definitely dialogue, like one suggesting why they, you know, why they thought something, and the other, you know, saying why they disagreed. And so it was just a great demonstration of, you know, that the executive don't necessarily agree all the time either. Because I think when, depending on what level you're at, and I was senior manager at that time, you know, you don't always, you're not always witness to that, right? Because eventually once the messaging comes out, it's all, you know, toe the line kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, it's interesting, Matt. I'm just thinking, I wonder if it's easier at both ends of the spectrum, like if you're an individual contributor or if you're in the C-suite, senior vice president. I wonder if the people in the middle, like middle managers or team leads, directors, I wonder if they actually feel this is more challenging.
Well, I think they may feel it's challenging, but when they witness that it's happening, that again, a lot of the thoughts that were being shared were, you know, those of modeling. And I think that was one that, like I said, like to this day, and that was probably, you know, 15 years ago, you know, but the image, maybe even longer, but the image for me is very, you know, like imprinted, I guess, on me. So
Can I ask, did it actually change the way you communicate?
I'm pretty open to begin with. So, but it definitely, it impacted how I communicated in that forum, right? So strategic planning was a cross mix of people from all over the organization, all within BC, and so it definitely like leveled up my feeling of safety in that forum for sure. But I was pretty candid. I was pretty candid before. So
Okay. The candid become more candider.
yeah,
Thank you for sharing that, Matt. And it's I recognize it's at 10:45, so we might start seeing people drop off, but there will be a recording of this conversation if you do have to leave, and you'll get the results of this after this. But please stay on. We're going to stay on for another 5 minutes to look at some of the top thoughts.
great, thank you.
One thing, Matt, I in my job in customer success, I have the privilege of speaking to customers. And what it's really interesting to see is how leaders in different sectors are either acknowledging they don't have answers because nobody has the answers, or if they think they have the answers, it's probably the wrong answer tomorrow if it's the right answer today. But I see this in industries that I would just maybe call more conservative by nature. And when I mean more conservative, I don't mean on a political spectrum, I mean more resistant to change. And so in the financial sector, sometimes there's this idea that as a leader, people are looking to me for answers. And I don't know what to do, and I'm freaking out, but I'm just going to try and have that leader hat on. So I think if it's anything, it's reassuring for me in speaking with people, understanding that universally, we're all figuring this out together. Okay, just do a few more thoughts. The walking the walk, not just talking the talk. That kind of relates to that top thought, but I think that's kind of what Matt was speaking to is a debate, a difference of opinion. But I think this thought is a little different in that if we were talking about ourselves within the organization, if we're in a leadership position, and it's not just a difference of opinion, maybe it's something that doesn't paint me or the organization in a good light. We are fearful of having those conversations because we're worried that's going to erode trust if people know that we're flawed. What I heard Matt say is like he's probably gained more respect for the people speaking because they were allowing a difference of opinion and they were taking that risk. Anybody else want to share around this thought? Okay. Hardest thing is on these things is allowing time for a space for people to answer, right? This is an interesting thought. Don't confuse oversharing with communication. So I'm wondering if anyone can speak to that thought about an example of that, or wants to drop it in the chat. Adam, welcome.
Thank you. This was not my thought, but I work in an organization where we're very large, and a lot of the communication happens via email. And so there's this misperception that because they've sent out 10 or 15 or 20 emails over time about a particular topic, that constitutes communication. Although I find that emails more often are noise at this point than they are a successful form of communication.
Great point. Yes. I think someone of my generation who, I don't want to sound like I'm from the Paleolithic or anything, but I got my first Hotmail account at university. So email was this wonderful tool to like communicate with like people. And so we'd write these long like emails, and like having to move from that paradigm of like, this is almost like a report I'm doing, to I gotta just the facts, you know, like make it short. It's better to do multiple, and maybe text messaging for many of you is like this too. You get that text from the friend who writes the novel and you're like, oh God, like break it up. So yeah, I think it's what I found, especially in the last several weeks, is that people are not in that patient brain mode where they can maybe have the interest to read a longer email. It's like they just want to know what you're trying to communicate very quickly. So there's the format of communication. And yes, that notion of sending emails. I've done my job to communicate because I sent an email. But it's also the content of those emails, I think, is also important, that sometimes we skirt around the big issues, the elephants in the room, by pointing out the smaller animals. So there's that. Brene Brown also talks about, she's got a new podcast series. My husband's listening to it. He's like, you got to listen to this part. She talks about floodlighting, which is when you as a leader, either intentionally or unintentionally, kind of delegate the emotional labor of being a leader onto people by talking about things that lead to uncertainty, but they think they're being empathetic. So I think we always have to be careful is that as well, is going back to that. What is my intention in having this dialogue with someone? Am I aware of my own motivations in this? What do I want for them, not from them? What do I want for them? And what is our shared outcome here? Adam, do you have anything to add to that, or are you good?
I think that was good for me.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Matt and Adam, for being brave souls. I'll talk about one more thought, and then I'm happy to stay on longer, but I recognize you've all got important work to do. So I really appreciate your time today. I think the thing, acknowledge mistakes so other will too. That kind of goes back to that thought of painting yourself in a good light. I think it's this idea of giving time for participants to contribute, giving people the space and the time. Does anybody want to speak to that? Hello, Charlotte.
Hi. So I'm Charlotte Baker, and what I was thinking when I put this here is really kind of the concept of wait time, making sure that people have time to gather their thoughts, that it's not something that we've got to hurry up and get all of these things out there, but that they have some time to really internalize, what it is that they want to say and how they put that information out there and share it out.
Do you have any best practices yourself, Charlotte, to share, or observations, what works and what doesn't?
Actually, just that the concept of wait time, just making people know that, it's okay to have, this silence, that I know that you're, having these thoughts, and just make that an all right practice. Make that a practice that you do all the time, that you provide people that think time, a little bit of downtime.
Yeah, I hear you, because I think that often what's typically been rewarded is decisiveness, in the momentness, right? Being quick on your feet. Those things are celebrated, but it doesn't necessarily acknowledge people who do need reflection, who do actually benefit from having some time to think more deeply, and who need silence. And when we ran the exchange, I really tried my darndest. It's so hard just to be silent, to let people share in those 4 or 5 minutes, because I think that once again, that whole, I'm leading this webinar, I've got to like be adding value at every possible moment. I think, Charlotte, what you speak to is sometimes giving people the space and the silence, the positive silence, is your best thing you can do as a leader.
Exactly.
Wonderful. Anybody else want to speak to that? Or Charlotte, please say more if you'd like. Okay, well, I think our original promise with the Leadership Book Club that they would be 45 minutes. I see I've gone over. This is just meant to be a little break in your day and hopefully just give you some food for thought. We'll be sending out the replay, the link to the replay of this webinar, the exchange results, and a short questionnaire to continue to improve these leadership book clubs. They kind of just started as an idea, and so far so good, but we really want to make sure that you as participants are getting value from this time together, but also have some value adds afterwards. So maybe some ideas for exchanges, those kinds of things. We're really looking to improve our own virtual events continually. So please give us your feedback. And I thank you so much on behalf of Amelia and myself. Amelia's got to give her a shout out. She is our virtual events empress and does a wonderful job for us here. So I just wanted to thank you so much for coming today. And thank you, Charlotte, that's kind. And yeah, I'm glad you like the Leadership Book Club. So I thank you so much for coming. Have a wonderful time. And I look forward to meeting you again in hopefully a month or 2 months or whenever the next one is, to talk about another book, hopefully in happier times.